In the late 1990s, Counter-Strike was the FPS that took PC gaming by storm. The simple Half-Life mod developed by two students that quickly grew into one of the most popular first-person shooters in the span of just a few years. And where many other games made waves on the console platforms throughout the 2000s, CS remained the premier competitive FPS experience on PC exclusively, still managing to be one of the most popular at that. But there was a pretty obscure and surprisingly good console version of Counter-Strike from back in the day that is often either dismissed or not known about entirely. So with that, let's take a look at Counter-Strike's 2003 Xbox port, its development and features, and just how well it stacked up to the classic, well-known PC versions of CS. When Valve acquired Counter-Strike and released it as a standalone game in 2000, it caused it to grow immensely across the PC gaming community. Along with this fast growth, the game's potential was bound to catch the eyes of many in the industry, including Ritual Entertainment's CEO at the time, Steve Nicks. He would get into contact with Valve in early 2001 to discuss the possibility of working with them on a new title in their Counter-Strike series, and with the upcoming debut of Xbox Live slated for November 2002, it seemed like the ideal time for Counter-Strike to make the jump to consoles. And so development for the proposed Xbox version would be started by Gearbox Software, after they finished up their work on Half-Life Blue Shift in 2001. At the same time, Gearbox would also be tasked with development of Counter-Strike Condition Zero, which was essentially a CS game that would focus much more on a scripted single-player experience. Since both games were being developed around the same time and shared the same general concepts, much of the content and ideas would overlap in both games. Gearbox would continue their development until mid-2002, when the company left both projects behind to focus on other ventures instead. And with EA Games cancelling the PC port for Lord of the Rings Two Towers, Ritual Entertainment now had a team looking for work. So Valve took up Nix's previous offer and they started working on both Condition Zero and the Xbox port in summer of 2002. This Xbox version was said to feature a scripted single-player campaign similar to what was planned for Condition Zero, as well as multiplayer via Xbox Live or System Link. It was also supposed to feature new Xbox exclusive content, such as new weapons, single-player and multiplayer maps, even with an extra bonus mission that was supposed to be set in space, all of which was going to remain exclusive to the console. The game would first be showcased in the May 2003 issue of Game Informer and would be unveiled at Microsoft's E3 booth the same year, providing a 4v4 multiplayer demo for convention goers. With Ritual Entertainment wrapping up development of Condition Zero in 2003, and with a pretty tight deadline of November, they would move their full team over to focus on the Xbox version. It was around this time that Valve decided to make some changes to the game's direction, where they would scrap the idea of a more linear scripted campaign, as well as scrapping the idea to have that Xbox exclusive content. It seemed the original idea to have a unique Counter-Strike experience for the Xbox shifted over to having the goal of replicating the well-known PC version of CS as closely as possible. Condition Zero would also see its campaign idea scrapped, but some of this content would be released later with the included deleted scenes add-on. The Xbox version of Counter-Strike would release on schedule on November 18, 2003. The game sold much better than expected, and even today it may surprise many people to know that it actually became incredibly popular amongst the Xbox player base at the time.
This is Counter-Strike as it's been shaping up for the Xbox. Plus, this will mark the first console release for the much-hyped series, and it's about time.
The critical reception for CSX was generally positive, or at the very least, average across the board. It was praised for how closely it resembled the PC versions with its multiplayer, but the lack of the anticipated campaign and exclusive content was regarded as a bit disappointing. As for the general community response to the game, it was actually very positive. Many enjoyed the CS experience on a console platform, even those who had also enjoyed it on the PC prior. Most of the community today dismisses the Xbox version as simply being inferior to the PC release, and while I can't necessarily disagree with this entirely, it is after all Counter-Strike on an Xbox, a game that became widely known for its highly skilled, competitive, and precise gameplay, things that consoles just weren't known for at the time. So, the big question here, how does it stack up to the traditional PC versions of Counter-Strike? As far as a direct comparison, suffice to say, this version very closely resembles Condition Zero, with a few parts of the original Counter-Strike mixed in as well. A majority of the game mainly takes on the look and feel of Condition Zero though, featuring its updated graphics, textures, and models. It had your typical hostage rescue mode and defuse mode, which they decided to call Demolition this time around, containing essentially the same weapons, equipment, and factions as what was later offered in Condition Zero. Although there were no exclusive ones, most of the well-known classic CS maps made it over to the Xbox. Locations like Aztec, Dust, Italy, Militia, and many others. Most of these were taken from the original CS and updated by Ritual, who made it clear they didn't want to do any major alterations to any of the existing maps. The main changes are mostly the different, often higher quality textures, some lighting changes, and some minor geometry edits. I did spend quite a bit of time running through and exploring these levels out of curiosity, but other than the textures and lighting, happily I couldn't really see any major differences. Layout-wise, the maps are pretty well identical to their original versions, and about a month after release, a free DLC would be offered that added in Office and Inferno, because, come on, you can't have a Counter-Strike game without Office. Alas, the original Xbox Live has been dead for years, along with my 56K modem. In other words, the multiplayer is no longer multiplayerable, so I'll have to settle for the single-player experience instead. So with that, I jumped into the training mode first on Italy, which really just runs you through the basics of Counter-Strike. Unfortunately, I could barely even get through this part as the hostage area was so dark, I couldn't even see my own view model. But I'm going to chalk this up to the fact that I'm playing on a modern display, which reminds me that I really do need to get a CRT if I plan to look at more of these old games. So after smashing into walls for a few minutes, I finally managed to get the hostages to follow me, and what the hell are these models? Now that I've finally learned the basics of Counter-Strike after all these years, I then hopped into the single player mode, which is really more or less just sort of an offline with bots mode. It's similar to Condition Zero's Tour of Duty mode, except you don't get to see the world map screen that lists each mission, and you also can't pick any of your individual teammates. You pretty much just choose a game mode and a map. And I've gotta say, for all the things I've heard over the years about this version being so bad, I was pretty surprised with just how well it actually played. It has its obvious differences when compared side by side, but all told, for Counter-Strike on an Xbox, it's actually quite good and even impressive. The only way I could describe it is that it's more or less like playing Condition Zero but with a controller, which leads me to my first problem with this version, that being, well, the downside of playing CS with a controller. Much like I said in my previous video about Half-Life's PS2 version, the game was a very competent port, but there's just something about playing Gold Source Engine games with a controller that just feels, I don't know, kind of wrong. Either way though, once I got used to the default control scheme, I actually started to do well against the bots that I definitely made sure to set to the hardest difficulty. I'd say the problem with the controls mostly boils down to the fact that, well, to most people, CS is just known as a keyboard and mouse sort of game, but all in all, I'd say they did the best they could do. Adding in a subtle auto-aim system to make up for this lack of precision was the obvious choice. It's not super noticeable, but you can absolutely tell it's helping me from this footage. And while many people think CSGO was the first and only CS game to have the wheel menu design, it was actually designed and added to the Xbox version first. And this may be a hot take here, but am I the only one that actually kind of misses the old wheel menu from CSGO? As for the technology behind it, the game ran on the same Gold Source engine, albeit with slight modifications for the Xbox. This time featuring detail textures for layering different textures with transparency on top of one another. Textures could also now use up to 32-bit color palette instead of just being an 8-bit palette like before, since the Xbox was now using Microsoft's new DirectX texture format, allowing for more efficient game performance and file size. Other than the controls, as I mentioned, this rendition of CS is actually quite good, but does have a major drawback for me, and that being the community aspect. A big part of what made Counter-Strike so popular and fun was its community, the traditional browser with thousands of community-hosted servers, each having their own list of players and clans, even offering tons of custom maps and mods. This system was replaced by a matchmaking service through Xbox Live, which is understandable, as that's just how console networks functioned, but it meant that players on the Xbox would miss out on a huge part of what made the game and its community so great in the first place. In the end though, I can't really let that change my opinion on the game. Like I said, it's just the nature of how consoles and their network services are designed, so the developers didn't have so much of a say in the matter. Aside from this, there really isn't much more to say, just due to the fact that it's so similar to the versions of Counter-Strike you'd find on PC at the time. Obvious differences aside, the two traditional game modes as well as pretty much all of the same weapons, equipment, factions, and maps that CS is widely known for are mostly here. So if the overall aim of this version was to develop a console Counter-Strike game that was as close as it could be to the PC, then it's done a damn good job of it. Now when I take a look at these older games, I'd like to look at them as though I'm reviewing them back when they were just released. And in the end, when looking at Counter-Strike Xbox Edition through that lens, It's almost hard to find bad things to say about it, especially when you take into account the tight deadlines, as well as the obvious hardware and controller limitations. I'd be lying if I said I would rather play this than any of the mainline PC versions of Counter-Strike that we're all used to, but if you were a console player at the time, this would have been your only way of experiencing Counter-Strike. The game even has quite the legacy, becoming the 9th best-selling Xbox game of all time with over 1.5 million copies sold, and quickly rose to be one of the most played games on Xbox Live at the time, achieving platinum status soon after its debut. It was also later included in the best of range of titles for the console and was added to the official list of backwards compatible games for the Xbox 360 a few years later. Suffice to say, it did much better than the later console release of CSGO in 2012, but I'm gonna leave that one to another video.